Thanks for coming today. First, I want to talk a little bit about what soil health is. And I think the two presenters this morning did a really good job at this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just want to ask you really quick, how would you define soil health? Anybody? What do you think? There's lots of definitions out there, but I think they're all pretty similar. Any ideas? Nothing? So there's a lot out there, but I guess I think it's kind of intuitive. People have described soil health as the soil's ability to function and to perform all of the functions that we care about, right? And there's several functions that we care about. I think most of us care probably most about its function, that is food production. We want the soil to produce good, healthy, nutritious, high yielding crops, right? That's the function that we've come to really expect of the soil. There's lots of other things that the soil does, and those are important too. And so soil health is kind of all of those things together, helping the soil function and do all of those things that we want it to do. So what does a healthy soil look like? Does it look like that? No, right? A healthy soil might look something more like this. A soil that can produce. It can produce food, feed, fiber, fuel, and so that's what one looks like. So what are some characteristics of healthy soils? So as you think about your farms and some of your fields and some of your best fields, what are some of the characteristics of the soil in those fields? Any ideas? Loose soil. Yeah. Loose soil, easy to plant in. Good. Other ideas? Lots of organic matter. It's important. We all understand how important organic matter is to the soil. Good. Other thoughts? Maybe you guys don't have any good soils, do you? Smells different. Yeah. Good. Those are great thoughts. Thank you. So these are some things that and you've mentioned some of these, that other farmers in the country have said, that the healthy soils are deeper, they're darker, they're easier to plow or easier to plant in. They can hold more water, sponge up more water. They can drain better. They can break down crop residues faster. They have high organic matter, as mentioned. Less erosion, more earthworms. Someone mentioned here the smell too. They just smell better. Some other characteristics is that you might have lower fuel costs, less machinery wear and tear, less fertilizer required, less disease and insect issues or problems, higher crop yield, better quality crops, and due to better quality crops, maybe better animal performance because of a better crop. So those are some characteristics of soil health or healthy soils. And so how do we measure the health of our soils? I want to mention that this is something that we've done for a really long time. So soil health is kind of a new buzzword, but soil quality means almost the exact same thing, and we've focused on soil quality for a long time, for decades. We've researched different measurements in the soil and how they impact the soil's ability to function like we want it to. This is one of probably the early efforts to quantify soil quality. And what they did is they came up with indicators for different properties of the soil, for the physical, the chemical, and the biological properties. And they looked at some of these key properties, and they came up with these scoring functions to say this is where, from 0 to 100, this is where this property is at, and this is where we want it to be at for that soil to function at its ideal level. And so then they put these indicators or these scores together and came up with the soil quality index. And it's also It's also called a soil management assessment framework, where basically they developed algorithms where you take that soil quality index and you score it. So you come up with a physical score and a chemical or nutrient score and a biological score of your soil, and then you can add those all together to come up with a total score for your soil. Where is it at? How is it performing? And so that's been termed kind of a SMAF, Soil Health Index. So that was one of the first. Since then, there's been some others, and one of them that spawned from that was the Cornell Soil Health Test. And it measures some of the same properties that the SMAF does, but it does some other additional measurements. But it was really based on it. So this just shows that those two are really, really related. This was a large set of soil samples taken out in the Midwest recently, and it showed that the score that you get from the SMAF versus the score from the Cornell test are very similar. So the two tests might give you a lot of the same information. More recently, another test has come out called the Haney Soil Health Test. Has anyone heard of that test? A couple here. So this was a test developed by a scientist in Texas. His name was Rick Haney, and him and some others developed this test that was based mainly on soil respiration. When you re-wet a dried soil and measure how much CO2 is respired off of that soil, it gives you an indicator of how active the organisms are in your soil. And how active they are relates to how well your soil can perform those functions that you want it to perform. And so this Haney soil test a few years ago was started to be marketed through commercial soil test labs. So here's just an example of a couple. This is Woods End Laboratory out in the east, and this is the Midwest Laboratory. Both of them kind of slightly different output, but they both conduct this Haney soil health test, where you get the soil respiration and you measure other properties in the soil, and you can come up with a score, a soil health score, kind of in the same manner that you came up with the score for the SMAF test that I indicated.
You able to hear, or do you want a little mic for just right here, speaker?
Everybody here okay? Till I move? Okay.
Well, if you're facing
that way, then it's hard to hear. Okay. I'll try not to talk when I face that way. But let me know if you want me to use that. So this is the Haney soil test, and it's out there and it's available. The last test, which is probably the most inexpensive, is this example that I found recently. These are some folks at South Dakota State University, and they've been conducting this underwear test, where they give farmers a pair of whitey-tighties, and they have them go bury it out in the field, and then come back six to 8 weeks later and dig up the underwear and see how decomposed it is. And I thought that was an excellent way to just get a quick indicator of how active the microorganisms are in your soil. So that's another way. So when we think about now that we're trying to measure soil health, and there's still some things that we're working on, and we're trying to decide which indicators are the best that would help us know the health of our soil. As we're trying to do that and trying to improve the health of our soils, I think it's really important to remember that there's some things that we can't change about our soil. So maybe some people that inherited red hair or freckles are not very happy about it. There's some things about our soil that we can't change, right? And I think a great example of this is soil texture. We can't change the texture of our soil unless we erode it and lose it. we could change it. But in general, we can't really change the texture of our soil. And the texture and the parent material of soil causes its health to be very different, right? And this shows that. If you look at organic matter for different soil textures, we know that sandy soils don't have a lot of organic matter typically. And when you add more silt and you add more clay, you get more organic matter, and the potential is higher. So that's important to remember, that we have to take the soils that we've been given, that we're farming, and realize that there's some limitations inherent to that soil, but also realize that there's some things that we can change and improve, whatever soil we might be on. And also realize that we can change things pretty fast, right? We can have really positive and we can have really negative impacts on our soil. And so that means that we have a lot of weight, a lot of responsibility on our shoulders as farmers, to take care of the soil, because we can really mess it up and make it so that it's not very productive, it's not performing the functions it needs to in the future. So as we think about improving soil health, there's some core principles, things that we're trying to improve. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think it was covered pretty well this morning. But basically, what we're trying to do is protect the soil surface. We're trying to add organic matter. We know that that's important. We're trying to refine our inputs the best that we can, and we're trying to reduce or minimize the negative impacts that we have on the soil and the negative impacts of the soil on the environment. So those are kind of our goals, our principles, as we're thinking about trying to improve soil health. So how do we do that? What practices might improve the health of our soils? There's a lot out there, and you probably recognize some of these. We talk a lot about them, and we've talked a lot about them for a lot of years. No tillage, reduced tillage, precision agriculture, cover crops, manures, or compost, organic matter, things like that. These are some practices that should help improve the health of our soils. I think it's also helpful to think about soil health on a spectrum or a continuum. And this is a figure from a colleague in Missouri, Dr. Kristen Wiem. She put this together. They sampled soil from all of these different systems in Missouri, and they compared them. This is what they found, that there really was a striking difference, and I think we can understand that, a striking difference between perennial cropping systems and annual cropping systems. The perennial cropping systems were on that higher spectrum. They functioned better. They provided more services. But within each of those, the perennial and the annual cropping systems, there was some variation. And it depended on how many of those practices that were incorporated. So for example, the annual cropping systems, you can see there, if you had a system that was tilled and a monoculture, like corn and soybean, the typical rotation in the Midwest, you were on the lowest end of the spectrum. But if you started adding things like manure, like no tillage, like crop rotation, or combinations of those things, you moved higher on that soil health spectrum. Your soil was better. It had a higher soil health score. It was able to perform those functions better. So I think it's important to remember that spectrum and think about where you're at and where you could be, but also realize that we're not all going to get right there. We're not all going to get to that high end of the spectrum, because that highest end of the spectrum was land that really is not used for agriculture. It was CRP land, and that's probably not where we can't we can't put all of our acres there. So we have to realize where we're at on the spectrum and what our potential is. Today I want to talk about just 2 or 3 practices that could help improve soil health and what we found in some long-term trials on these practices. So the 2 I want to mention is no tillage and cover crops. These are 2 that we've known about for a really long time. We've studied a lot, but we're still kind of struggling to adopt them in some places. And especially out here in the West, I think we're trying to figure out how they fit into our system and how we can make them work. This just shows that about half of the growers still till and don't adopt any form of reduced tillage. About a third of the producers in our region area have gone to no-till, strictly no-till, and then the rest have kind of done some kind of reduced tillage. So we are making some progress, I think, with tillage, but there's still a lot of opportunity there. With cover crops, it's much lower. There's a lot of excitement out there about cover crops. We're trying things, but it's just not yet on the majority of our acres, and especially here in the West, less than 1% of the acres of our cropland have cover crops. So there's a lot of opportunities, but I think there's also a lot of challenges. This is a survey that was conducted by SARE, and they asked hundreds of farmers who had started to adopt cover crops what were their challenges. And as you can imagine, these were some of their top ones. It was difficult to establish it. The seed cost a lot of money. It took a lot of time and labor to seed the cover crop, and figuring out the right species for their farm was an issue. So there's lots of challenges that we're still working through and trying to overcome. But what about long-term success of these practices? And this is something that we really don't have a lot of information on. So I mentioned we've studied these things for decades, but we really don't have a lot of long-term trials that have cover crops. We have quite a few that have no tillage, but we don't have very many that have cover crops. And so some people in Missouri had a lot of foresight. It wasn't me. I was 5 years old when this study started, but they had a lot of foresight. In the early 90s, they set up some large plot trials and a field trial where they started incorporating cover crops as part of replicated treatments, and they kept them in place since that time. And so today I want to just share a few of the results from those studies to help us learn a little bit about what we can expect or what we might expect in the long term when we think about no tillage or cover crops. So first I'm going to talk about the plots. So in these plots they had 3 systems that were replicated. They had a conventional tilled system with corn and soybean. They had another system where it was just they took out tillage, so it was still that corn-soybean rotation. And then the third was no tillage with an extended rotation of wheat, so it was a corn-soybean wheat rotation, and then there was cover crops in that system as well. The cover crops were mainly red clover and hairy vetch, and that system, the most diverse system, also had less, because of the cover crops and the crop rotation, it had less total herbicide application than the other 2 systems. The other unique part about this trial is that it was conducted on a hill slope. So we had summit, we had slopes, back slopes, and then we had the foot slope. And this was especially important because we wanted to understand how they perform at different places on the landscape, but we also wanted to look at the sloping part of the soil. It's where that part of the soil is most vulnerable to erosion because it has slope, and you can see that it had the lowest topsoil depth, the shallowest soil, due to the sloping nature. And so this really helped to see how they perform on different spots of the landscape. It was conducted over 17 years, which really gives you a good range of weather conditions. So you get years that are really wet, years that are dry, years that are closer to average. So the first result I want to show you is that both of these conservation systems did quite well at maintaining corn yield. They either maintained it, in some cases they increased it. We did see a slight reduction in corn yield at the foot slope position of that diversified crop rotation system compared to the other 2. But in general, they maintained yield quite well. The 2 conservation systems were also a little bit more stable in their yield from year to year. They increased stability by about 16%, meaning that the weather had less influence on yield in those 2 systems than it did in the conventional system. And then the variability. So no tillage, just the system with no tillage reduced variation in corn yield from year to year, but that other conservation system really had no impact on variation. Just to summarize real quick, wheat, I'm not going to talk about soybean because I don't know that it applies too much to us here, but wheat did quite well. It averaged 42 bushels in the trial. It was less variable in yield than the corn and the soybean. and it was also not impacted by landscape position. So the wheat did well on every part of the landscape, in contrast to corn or soybean. Now for the soil aspect. So this shows results from the SMAF test that I mentioned earlier, where you have scores for the physical, the chemical, the nutrient, and the biological aspects of the soil. And what we found here is not, so this is after about 10 to 12 years, we did not see a lot of difference in the soil health indicators. The main difference that we did see was right here in the biological score. So this shows the top 2 inches of the soil and then the next 4 inches below that. And the biggest difference that we saw was in that top 2 inches of the soil. We did see a greater biological score when we used the conservation systems. So it means that the microorganisms were more abundant and they were more active when we had those conservation systems, and especially when we had the cover crops and the diversified crop rotation, we saw the greatest biological activity in that soil. So just to summarize what I've talked about, these both conservation systems did quite well. They maintained or they improved yield, they reduced yield variation, and they improved yield stability, and it looks like they were having some positive impacts on the health of the soil. Now I want to share just a little bit about the field. So this was the adjacent field. It was 88 acres, and for the first decade, the farmer managed that field just like the rest of his fields. He tilled it every year. He had a corn-soybean rotation. He applied uniform inputs to the field. And then after about 10 or 11 years, we leased the field from him and started what we call a precision and a conservation system. So we switched the crop rotation in part of the field. We took out corn from the north part and we put in wheat because corn was often not profitable. We switched to no tillage across the whole field. We added cover crops every year to the whole field. And then we also did some precision agriculture, where we put nutrients on in either a zone application or with the sensor. We applied nitrogen at a variable rate to both wheat and corn in that system. So what we wanted to do was several practices that might help improve the health of the soil, provide some environmental benefits, and wanted to see how that affected yield, profit, and other things. So I want to share just a few of the results. But before that, I guess I'll mention the cover crops that we used. So for the cover crop following the wheat, we could plant it early in the late summer, and so we could get a lot of growth. So we usually planted a 6 to 8 species mix that had lots of legumes, lots of brassicas, and then some other grasses in that mix. And then following the corn, it was generally cereal rye, and in some years we did a mix where we put some other things in there with the cereal rye. So these maps show the profit across that entire field for each year. And this is starting in 1993 when it was managed conventionally. I didn't put a legend up there, but just realize that the green means that it was profitable and the red means that it was not profitable. We didn't return or have a profit in that area. So you can see the first 4 years, it was quite profitable. Some years we had areas of the field that were not quite as profitable, and sometimes that variation changed. Here's the next four set of years. See, some years we really make a lot of money, and some years we make nothing. Take a loss on almost the whole field. And then the last 3 years of that system, again, we saw some lower profits in those yields, in those years. And if you notice that sometimes the corn did well, but most often the corn was not profitable, especially in that north part of the field. And so we decided, well, we're going to take it out. So in 2004, we implemented that system. We took wheat out of the north part of the field, we took corn out of the north part of the field and we added wheat. And then we watched it for the next 11 years. So that was the first year of the system. Soybean did quite well. And then here's the next 4 years. You can see that wheat did did quite well in the north part of the field for that first 2 cycles. Here's the next 4 set of years. In this one, the wheat did not do well in the north part of the field. The soybean in most years continued to do well. Soybean is the best crop in Missouri. It does the best. And here's the last 2 years. This just shows all of them together. And I realize it's probably kind of hard to make all those comparisons, but just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of what the profit looked like from year to year in that field. And really just wanted to highlight this figure here. So this shows the actual difference in yield, variation, and profit between those 2 systems. And these are the statistical differences. So the first one is yield. So we really, we saw in some areas that are orange there, that there was an improvement in yield by adding that wheat. But then in other areas, that blue area, that's the drainage channel, stays really wet. The wheat did not do as well as the corn. So if you looked on average, some areas had better yield, some areas had worse yield. There was really not a lot of difference in yield between those 2 systems. The second set of figures there is the variation. You can see that it's variable. But what I want to highlight is in that south portion of the field, you can see a lot of orange there. It looks like we were able to reduce variation in corn yield by using that precision and conservation system. And then that third map on there is probably the most important. That's the difference in profit between those 2 systems. And you'll see there that we really did not have a large difference in profit between the 2. And I should mention that for the precision and conservation system, we did not include any subsidy for the cover crop. So all of the costs of the cover crop were added in. And that added cost of the cover crop and some reduced cost from no tillage, it looks like they evened out. Across those 10 or 11 years, we really saw no large differences in profit between the 2 systems. Now that blue area where we did get a decrease in profit right in the channel, in the drainage channel, we think a large part of that was due to not being able to get good soybean stands with no-till in that drainage channel. But overall, it was really encouraging. We could implement a system that had added costs of cover crops, some reduced costs of no tillage, and we could maintain profits over the long term. Soil health, it also, we're still working on some of these analyses, but early indicators suggest that we are seeing some improvements in the health of the soil in that field. This is just the total SMAF score, and it's increased since we've implemented that precision and conservation system. I also want to mention that, when we started out, we were really hoping we'd see some yield gains, or some profit gains, and we really didn't see those. But I do think that it's very encouraging that these systems did quite well, maintain profit, even though the weather conditions during that system were more extreme than the conventional system. So this just shows that during that conservation system period, we had 3 years that were quite extreme. So in 2005, we had a really wet spring. In 2008, we had a really wet late summer, fall. And then in 2012, you'll remember we had the drought, the widespread drought, where it was very hot and very dry. And so even though we had those extreme conditions, that conservation system still maintained yield, still maintained profit, suggesting that it can provide some resiliency to our cropping systems. So just to summarize those field results, I think I've kind of been doing that as I go along, but they did quite well. They could maintain yield and profit and do that even when we had more extreme growing conditions. So as we talk about soil health, and I've just showed you results from the Midwest, and I think a lot of our results come out of the Midwest. what does it mean for us here in the West, and what does it mean in Utah when we think about trying to improve the health of our soils? And I think it's really important to remember that we have different systems. They're quite different. Our systems in Utah are alfalfa dominated. Most of our cropping systems have alfalfa in them. So we have this perennial crop aspect, right? Most of us keep our alfalfa in for 5 to 10 years, so we're not tilling for 5 to 10 years. And the alfalfa is a perennial, and it's providing a lot of benefits to the soil while it's in place. And so, but we also have grain crops, right? We grow a lot of wheat. We're growing more and more corn in the state. And so there are some opportunities on the annual cropping side to maybe improve some soil health. And then that other key factor that's a difference in our systems is that we're water stressed. All right, water is critical to all of our farming. So it's a little bit different, and we might have to think about soil health in different ways than maybe just no-till or just cover crops, given that our systems are that way. So here's just a few ideas that I threw up, things that we're working on, things that others are working on in the state, where some opportunities might be for improving soil health in our systems. So as I mentioned, if we're working in an alfalfa-dominated system, but we rotate alfalfa out and we put grain crops in, there's opportunities to maybe reduce or eliminate some of our tillage. We've found that no tillage corn, for example, into an alfalfa stand that were terminated actually works quite well. So there might be some opportunities when we rotate out of alfalfa and go into other grain crops to reduce tillage, to add some cover crops, and maybe to retain some more crop residue. Some other ideas are, and I think this was covered really well, there might be opportunities for livestock integration into our systems, getting cattle or sheep or other livestock back onto the land to help provide some of those benefits. There might also be opportunity for compost or manure. I know we're doing work on compost in dryland systems to see if we can apply it in an economical way and help improve the health of our soil. Up by Snowville, there was a trial that was put in several decades ago where they put really large applications of compost, and you can still see the difference. I mean, it's a visual difference in the performance of the crop in the area that had compost versus that did not. So there might be some opportunities there to get more compost and manure out into our systems. And then just opportunities. I think we have a lot of opportunities to look at more integrated pest and nutrient management in our systems. So just some take-home thoughts. I showed you the results from the plots that we had in place for 17 years, and I showed you results from the field that we had in place for about 10 or 11 years. And what those two things indicate to me is that sometimes it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time to see some changes in our soil that we want. And so remember that and be patient and realize that it's a long-term investment. We can't really expect to go put some cover crops out or start cutting back on our tillage and see immediate results. In fact, we might see some immediate results, but they might be negative. But the message is if you stick with it and you keep going for a long term and treat it as a long-term investment, it can do quite well. We were working on the clay pan soil, which is in some ways much more restrictive than some of the soils that we have here, and it did pretty well. It could maintain yield and profit over that long period of time, and we started to see some changes in the soil, some indicators that we were improving soil health. Also, just keep in mind, as I mentioned, soil health is about more than just cover crops and no tillage. I think we fall into that sometimes, that those are probably the two most popular options that we talk about for improving soil health, but they are not they're not the only options. And they along with other practices, some of that I mentioned, can really help us improve the health of our soils. And then just last, get involved. Try it out on your farm. I'm not suggesting that you convert your whole farm to cover crops or no tillage, but test it out. I mean, I think it's so worth trying it on your farm, on a small piece of your farm, a small piece of your field. See if you can get it to work for you. Be patient with it. Give it a few years, and you might see some good results. I think that's all I have. Just want to thank you for your attention and take a few questions. We've got a minute. Any questions? Yeah.
The studies on the soybeans, what was those results?
Question was about the results for the soybeans.
Yeah.
Soybeans did quite well too. It could maintain in the plots. We maintained yield with the soybeans. We actually even increased yield some on the back slope position as well. But they were very, very similar to corn.
And then during the drought years for the no-till, did it hold the water better in those no-till areas other than versus the tillage? Or?
So the other question is about in the drought years, did the no-tillage system hold the water better than other years? So in Missouri, our system is very different than here. We're often concerned about too much water, and so in a lot of years we wanted water to move off because we had too much. In the drought year, obviously that wasn't the case. I wasn't there in 2012, and I don't know if they saw better infiltration in that year in the no-till system versus the others, but that's a good question. So, other questions?
Hey Matt,
Yeah.
what was your cover crop cost basically?
Questions about the cover crop costs. Just the cost of the seed,
Well, yeah.
or the total cost? So the cost of the seed usually is about $20 to $25 an acre. And when you get a 6 to 8 species mix, sometimes you go up just a little bit more, closer to $30 an acre. But that's about what you can expect for the seed. And that's if you're using a mixture. You can plant wheat or oats as a cover crop, and it's going to be cheaper than that. So there's some variation there. Any other questions?